The tablet is approximately 25 centimeters long and not quite 20 centimeters wide. It came out of Sippar, the ancient Babylonian city on the eastern bank of the Euphrates, sometime around 1889, which is to say it was excavated during the same decade that Edison was filing patents and the Eiffel Tower was going up, which is a strange pairing of moments to hold in the mind at once. 234, and it is described in the official catalogue record as being in just okay condition, which is the kind of institutional understatement that covers a great deal. 3 columns of cuneiform run down its face in close, neat rows, a trained scribe's hand, not an apprentice's. Clay has a property that no other writing medium has reproduced. Parchment burns, paper decays, wood rots, metal corrodes, papyrus dissolves in the wrong humidity. But clay, once dried or fired, even unintentionally, in the conflagrations that destroyed the buildings that housed it, does not forget. It is chemically inert in ways that organic materials are not. The signs pressed into its surface in 1635 BCE are as legible today as they were the morning the scribe lifted the stylus and set the tablet aside. When scholars speak of the cuneiform record as a uniquely durable archive, they mean something precise and physical. The medium of clay chose, through the specific chemistry of its survival, what the ancient world would be able to say to the modern one. 234, whatever the catalogue record means by just okay condition, has outlasted every library, every dynasty, every empire that stood between its making and this moment. That is not metaphor, that is material science. And what it chose to preserve, in the case of this particular tablet, is a theory of the human soul embedded in a grammatical pun that required 60 years of trained scholarship to describe in full. The crack did not break the tablet at a convenient place. Ancient Near Eastern materials do not accommodate scholarly convenience. It broke at precisely the passage that would occupy 3 generations of Assyriologists, broke there because that is where the tablet was handled most, consulted most, argued over most, held up to light, and turned in hands that were looking for the same thing the crack now obscures. Across the upper right corner there is a horizontal fracture that interrupts the text at precisely the passage that has occupied those 3 generations of Assyriologists more than almost any other in the ancient Mesopotamian corpus. That passage, in the first tablet of what scholars call the Atrahasis epic, describes the moment a god is killed so that humanity can be made from the mixture of his body and clay. This is not a secret. The Atrahasis has been translated and studied and discussed for over a century, and the story of the gods creating human beings to relieve themselves of labour is one of the most well-documented creation narratives in the ancient world. But the crack runs through the 3rd column at the line where the god's name appears, and the name is where the argument lives, because the name, in the Babylonian scribal tradition, is not decorative. The name is the theology. And in the Atrahasis, the theology of the human soul was not stated directly. G. Lambert's foundational edition in 1969 to TZVI, Abusha's analysis in 1998, before anyone described it fully in print. Wherever you are listening to this, and these texts have travelled further from their origin than almost anything else the ancient world produced, reaching readers and listeners in Lagos and London, in Karachi and Calgary, in Melbourne and Mumbai, you are in some sense downstream of what was pressed into that clay in Sippar sometime around 1635 BCE. The city of Sippar no longer exists. The Euphrates has shifted its course. But the tablet is still legible, and the wordplay is still there, and the Anunnaki are still present in the passage, not as the cosmic architects that popular treatments make them, but in a stranger and more specific role, as the divine authority that governs what the human soul carries, from the moment of creation through the moment of death and into whatever comes after it. That role, and what it implies about the soul's origin, is what the Sumerian and Babylonian cuneiform texts actually record, not in a single declaration, not in a creed or a catechism or a theology proper, but encoded, technically, deliberately in the language of scribal wordplay that required a specialist to read and apparently required a specialist to write, across several hundred clay tablets excavated from at least 3 different ancient cities, now distributed among at least 4 institutions on 2 continents, assembled and reassembled and partially recovered across nearly 150 years of scholarship. The Anunnaki do appear in these texts as authorities over human fate, not as architects of civilization in any popular sense, but as judges of what the dead carry with them into the underworld, and as the assembly that decreed, before humans existed, what humans would be made of. And the question of what humans carry, where it comes from, and why the scribes encoded that answer in a pun rather than a declaration, that is what this investigation is about. Before the wordplay in the 3rd column of the Atrahasis tablet can mean anything, the conditions that produced it need to be understood, not the mythology in broad strokes, the mythology in its technical detail where the theology actually lives. The slain god has 2 names in 2 different manuscript traditions. That divergence is not a copyist's error. It is the first sign that what appears to be a single creation story is carrying 2 different theories of the soul's origins simultaneously. 234 did not break the text at a convenient place. It broke it at the one place where the evidence is most precise and most contested, where what the Anunnaki knew and what the scribes preserved, and what every human being since the Sumerians has carried around without knowing it, all converge on a single damaged line of cuneiform. What the gods did before people existed. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent most of his professional life translating Sumerian texts at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia, wrote in 1944 that the Sumerian creation of humanity was primarily a labour story. The gods were tired, the work was too heavy, something had to change. Kramer's reading, published in Sumerian mythology by the American Philosophical Society, treated the creation of human beings as a pragmatic solution to a divine management problem, and for a long time that was the dominant frame. It is not wrong, but it is the kind of not wrongness that leaves out most of what is interesting, the way a correct answer to the wrong question is technically accurate and practically useless. Kramer's frame is a labour story because the surface of the text is a labour story. What Lambert and Millard were doing in 1969 was reading below that surface, and what they found there is the reason this tablet is worth 45 minutes of anyone's attention. The texts do say the labour explanation in terms that are almost bureaucratic in their directness. Gr. Millard published Atrahasis, the Babylonian story of the flood, through Oxford University Press. They presented a fuller picture of what the labour story actually contained, and the creation of humanity turned out to be carrying a great deal more than a management solution. The Atrahasis begins before humans exist, in a time when the gods themselves did all the physical labour of the world. The cosmological framework that the text presupposes is specific. The universe is divided, and the work of maintaining it, digging the riverbeds, managing the irrigation, sustaining the physical infrastructure of existence, falls to a class of gods called the Igigi. Above them sit the Anunnaki, the great gods, who do not work. This division is not explained or justified in the text. It is simply presented as the prior condition of things, the way the world was organised before anything went wrong. What went wrong is described with remarkable administrative specificity. The Igi, after working for what the text calls 3,600 years, a number that is almost certainly schematic rather than literal, a Mesopotamian way of signalling an inconceivably long time, revolt. They burn their tools, they march at night to Enlil's gate. The great god Enlil wakes to find the younger gods outside his house, and the conversation that follows reads, in Lambert and Millard's translation, like a labour grievance proceeding rather than a cosmic crisis. Enlil asks his chamberlain Nusku, who organised the revolt. The Igigi say, collectively, that every one of them did. The issue is the work. The load is too heavy. They want relief. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, whose Sumerian name means roughly Lord of the Earth or Lord of what is below, whose domain was the Absu, the freshwater ocean beneath the ground, proposes a solution. He is the god the assembly goes to when every direct approach has produced nothing but a larger version of the original problem. In the Nippur texts, in the Eridu texts, across the scribal traditions that touch Enki's mythology at any point, he is the figure who finds the opening that was always there and that no one else had the patience or the obliqueness of mind to see. The assembly of gods, confronted with an impossible labour problem, does what divine assemblies in these texts always do when the problem is genuine. They wait for Enki to speak. His proposal is that the gods create a substitute, a being capable of taking on the labour. This substitute will be made from clay and from one god. The god in question is described before he is named. The word the text uses for his defining quality is temu, which in Akkadian means intelligence, reason, the faculty of conscious comprehension. He volunteers, or in some readings of the passage, he is chosen by the assembly and killed. Lambert and Millard flagged this ambiguity in their 1969 edition without resolving it, and it has not been resolved since. Whether the god who dies to make humanity does so willingly or not is a question that the text, across all its surviving versions, declines to answer cleanly. What follows his death is described with the same practical precision as the labour revolt. The mother goddess, called Nintu in most versions, Ninhursag in others, Mami in still others, the text cycling through her names as though no single one is adequate, takes the god's flesh and blood and mixes them with clay. She shapes the result. The Anunnaki spit into the mixture. 7 male and 7 female human beings emerge, and the god's labour problem is, for the moment, solved. The text moves on. What it does not do, what it conspicuously, almost aggressively does not do, is ask whether the god who was processed into the clay had an opinion about the arrangement. That silence is not an oversight. In a tradition this precise about what it chooses to record, silence is always a choice. The mother goddess is given procedural instructions, not a meditation. She mixes, she shapes. The Anunnaki spit into the mixture as a ratification gesture, the divine equivalent of a governing body putting its seal on a policy instrument. 7 male and 7 female human beings are produced. The god's labour problem is resolved. What the Atrahasis is not, in this moment, is a text about the dignity of the god who dies. It is a text about the efficiency of the solution, and the efficiency of the solution is precisely what makes the solution's implications so difficult to hold. The tablet CBS 2168, held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and identified as a fragment of the Enki and Ninmah myth, excavated from Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania campaigns between 1889 and 1900, which recovered over 30,000 cuneiform tablets from the site, per documentation at the Oriental Institute, presents a variation on this creation event. In the Enki and Ninmah tradition, the creation of humans is a contest between Enki and Ninmah. They drink beer, they take turns fashioning people, they challenge each other to determine the fate of each creature they make. The animating principle in that text is not described in the same physiological terms as in Atrahasis. There is no explicit blood-mixing passage, but the assumption that each human being carries something divine is embedded in the narrative logic. Ninmah decrees the fate of each person she creates. Fate decreeing is the Anunnaki's primary function in the cosmological framework. The connection between divine fate authority and the divine element within human beings is, in both texts, present but unstated. It exists in the gap between what the stories say and what they assume. The god's name is where that gap becomes visible. In the most frequently cited version of the Atrahasis, he is called Wi'ilu, or Ilawela in some transcriptions, a name that does not appear elsewhere in the Mesopotamian pantheon, and that scholars have treated primarily as a designation rather than an identity. A god, a divine being of sufficient standing to provide the necessary material, but not a major deity with an independent tradition. Lambert's analysis noted this divergence. The implications of the alternative name, why the Sumerians would name the god whose blood created humanity after the faculty of understanding that his blood was supposed to transmit, were not pursued in the 1969 edition. They would wait 30 years for Abush. The Anunnaki, through all of this, are present at the margins of the creation event. They do not perform the mixing, they do not shape the clay, but they are the assembly in whose presence the decision is made, and they are the gods who spit into the mixture, a gesture that functions in the text as a kind of ratification, a mark of divine investment in what is being made. Their relationship to the resulting creatures is, from the beginning, the relationship of authorities to a substance they have endorsed. What they endorsed, what they put their authority behind, is a being made partly from a god, and that being's animating principle, the quality that the god's blood was supposed to transfer, carries a name that the scribe embedded in the text not once but 3 times, folded into the language so that only someone reading with close attention to Akkadian phonology would notice it at all. The pun that is not a joke. In Babylonian Akkadian, the word etemu, often transliterated as etemu, means the ghost of a dead person, the animating spirit that survives the body's death and descends into the underworld. It is the term the Mesopotamian texts use most consistently for what a human being carries that continues after the physical body has ceased. Not a soul in any abstract philosophical sense, but a specific entity, capable of hunger and suffering and joy, capable of being appeased by offerings and angered by neglect, capable of haunting the living, if not properly buried and fed. The word Temu, often transliterated as Temu, means intelligence, rational faculty, the capacity for conscious thought. It is also the word used for the divine quality that the god's blood was meant to transfer to the clay, the animating principle of human intelligence, the thing that makes a human being capable of reasoning rather than merely moving, and the word Damu means blood. In Akkadian, Etemu, Temu, and Damu are not etymologically related, they do not share a root, but in the Atrahasis passage describing the creation of humanity, they appear in sequence, in close proximity, linked by the narrative logic of the creation event itself. The god's Damu, blood, is mixed with clay to transmit his Temu, understanding, and what the resulting human carries forward is the Etemu, ghost principle. Tzvi Abosh, in his 1998 essay, Ghost and God, Some Observations on a Babylonian Understanding of Human Nature, published in Self, Soul and Body in Religious Experience Through Brill, was the first scholar to describe this sequence in full and to argue that it is not coincidental. The triple convergence, blood, intelligence, ghost, is the Atrahasis scribe's theory of the human soul, and it was written in a form that required the reader to hold all 3 terms in mind simultaneously before the argument becomes legible. A pun in the ancient Near East was not a joke. Jean Botteo, the French Assyriologist whose 1992 work Mesopotamia, Writing, Reasoning and the Gods, published in French as Mesopotamie, l'écriture, la raison et les dieux, and in English translation by the University of Chicago Press, devoted considerable attention to the Mesopotamian use of wordplay as a vehicle for theological argument. In the scribal tradition of ancient Mesopotamia, a pun was a claim about the nature of things. If 2 words sounded similar, or if their consonantal structure overlapped, the overlap was not accidental. It was evidence of a real connection at the level of reality itself. Language, in this framework, was not a representation of the world. It was a trace of the world's actual structure, and the scribe who found a convergence in the phonology was uncovering something that was true in a deeper register than simple fact. The Atrahasis pun, as Abush reconstructed it, works like this. The god who is killed to make humanity is the god who has Kemu, intelligence. His Damu, blood, is the physical medium through which his Kemu passes into the clay mixture, and the quality that the human being carries as a result, the animating divine principle within every person, is the Temu, which shares its consonantal skeleton with Kemu. The scribe has embedded the theory of the soul's divine origin inside a set of phonological echoes, so that the argument is present in the text, but only accessible to a reader who notices the echoes and follows them to their conclusion. The Atemu is what it is because it comes from a god's Kemu transmitted through the Damu, the human ghost soul, the thing that survives death, that the Anunnaki will eventually judge in the underworld, is a direct inheritance of divine intelligence compressed into biological form. The interpretation is open, the wordplay is not. The bilingual Sumerian Akkadian tablet, known as KR4, held in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, contains a related but distinct creation account. In the KR4 text, a god is also killed to provide the animating element for humanity, and the procedure also involves a mixing with clay. Abush analysed this text alongside the Atrahasis in his 1998 essay and noted that the KR4 account preserves the same basic structure: divine death, clay, human creation, but in a somewhat different theological key. The two texts are independent, which means the theory they share is not a textual copy. It is a genuine convergence across different scribal traditions, which is the kind of corroboration that tends to get scholars' attention. What neither text does is explain the wordplay. The theory of the soul's origin was embedded in the text and left for the reader to find or not find. Abush's analysis is, as far as the scholarly record shows, the fullest published treatment of the convergence, and even his essay acknowledges that the Atrahasis passage remains interpretively open. The pun can be seen. What cannot be determined from the surviving evidence is how widely the scribal tradition understood it to carry a specific theological argument, and whether the absence of explicit commentary was a feature of the tradition, a deliberate choice to encode rather than declare, or simply a function of what has survived. The ghost soul, the Atemu, came from the blood of a god who possessed understanding. That much the wordplay preserves. What the Atemu then becomes, where it goes, what it carries, and who decides what happens to it, that is where the Anunnaki's specific role in the human soul's story begins. Before this investigation moves into the underworld, before we follow the Atemu to the place where the Anunnaki are waiting to assess what it carries, stop for a moment and tell me where you are, what city, what country, what hour it is where you are sitting or lying or walking with this in your ears. These texts have been read on every continent, in every time zone, by people the scribe who pressed these signs into clay in Sippar could not have imagined. That fact does not get less strange with repetition. Leave it in the comments. I read them, and the geography of the audience for ancient Mesopotamian documentary narration is one of the genuinely surprising things this channel has produced. We will continue. Before that story can be followed though, there is the question of which god was killed, because the Atrahasis and its cognate traditions do not agree on the answer, and the disagreement turns out to be more theologically significant than a simple variant reading. One name is a placeholder, the other is a claim. The Igigi Rebellion and the Book of Labour, the Igigi Rebellion in the Atrahasis, is described over approximately the first 350 lines of the first tablet, and reading it in Lambert and Millard's edition produces a persistent sense of dislocation. The text is unquestionably cosmological. It is about the origins of things, about the structure of the divine world before humans existed. But the language in which the god's grievance is expressed belongs to a different register entirely. The younger gods complain about their burden in terms that have more in common with a labour dispute than with a cosmic drama. The work is too hard. The nights are too long. The loads are excessive. They have been digging for an incomprehensible span of time, and they want relief. University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur, conducted between 1889 and 1900 and recovering over 30,000 tablets, documented at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, produced most of the Sumerian literary corpus that scholars now work with, including the tablets from which the Sumerian precursors to the Atrahasis tradition were reconstructed. The tablets from Nippur span a vast range of genres: hymns, laments, administrative records, school exercises, king lists, mythographic narratives. What they make clear, when examined as a whole, is that the Sumerian scribal tradition did not separate administrative and cosmological language into distinct registers. A divine assembly operated by the same procedural logic as a human one. A god who wanted relief from labour could petition the council. A mother goddess who disagreed with the assembly's decision could argue her case. The cosmos was organised along lines that a literate Mesopotamian bureaucrat would have recognised immediately, because the bureaucratic structure of Sumerian civilization was understood to mirror the cosmic one, or, more precisely, to be derived from it. This is not a figure of speech that the Sumerians were using loosely. The great temple complexes of Nippur, and Uruk operated as economic and administrative centres in the most literal sense. They managed grain distribution, tracked labour obligations, issued rations, recorded land tenure. The same clay tablets that preserved the Atrahasis and the descent of Inanna also preserved receipts for barley, inventories of temple equipment, and administrative decrees about canal maintenance. The scribal tradition that transmitted the creation myths was the same tradition that managed the physical infrastructure of Sumerian civilization. When those scribes described a divine assembly making an administrative decision about the creation of humanity, they were not reaching for a metaphor. They were using the only vocabulary they had for the way consequential decisions got made, because in their experience, consequential decisions were made in assemblies, ratified by recognized authorities, and implemented through designated agents. The cosmos worked the same way the city worked, because the city had been built on the model of the cosmos. The Atrahasis is, among other things, the minutes of the divine assembly meeting at which the human question was resolved. This has a direct bearing on the creation of humanity, because the decision to make humans is an administrative decision. Enki proposes it. The assembly ratifies it. The mother goddess is tasked with execution. The god who dies to provide the animating material is, in this framework, not a martyr in any theological sense. He is a resource that the assembly has identified and allocated. The fact that the text describes him as volunteering, or does not describe him as resisting, may be less about his divine nobility and more about the administrative smoothness of the procedure. A resource that goes willingly requires less management. What the Igigi were doing when they worked, digging riverbeds, carrying the soil, managing the water table, was maintaining the physical infrastructure of the world. Their labour was what kept the cosmos running. The Lil, the wind breath, the animating force that Enlil embodied as Lord Wind, was part of what drove this system. The atmosphere was a product of Enlil's domain, and without it nothing grew, nothing breathed, nothing moved. The Igigi were not merely labouring in a generic sense. They were sustaining a system that depended on specific kinds of divine energy, and when they stopped, the world began to fail. The connection between Enlil's atmospheric domain and the labour of the Igigi is not incidental to the creation story. If the Igigi were sustaining the atmospheric system that Enlil governed, managing the conditions under which breath, growth and movement were possible, then their labour was not merely physical work in any modern sense. It was the ongoing maintenance of the medium of life itself. When they stopped, the world did not simply become less organised, it began to fail at the level of the atmospheric conditions that allowed anything to be alive. This is the urgency behind the divine labour crisis, not efficiency, not convenience, but the imminent collapse of the living medium. And this is why the solution that Enki proposes cannot be merely biological. The human beings who will replace the Igigi are not simply bodies that can lift and carry. They need to understand what they are maintaining and why. They need the Timu, the divine intelligence, that will allow them to participate in the cosmic maintenance that the Igigi had been performing. The blood of a god who possessed understanding is not a symbolic gesture, it is a technical requirement. This is relevant because the animating principle that the slain god contributes to the human creation is not simply blood in a biological sense. The Damu carries the Timu, the understanding, but the Timu is not merely intellectual capacity. In the framework the Atrahasis presupposes, understanding is connected to the capacity to participate in the maintenance of the cosmos. The Igigi who dug the riverbeds knew what they were doing. Their labour was informed by divine comprehension of how the world worked. What was compressed into the clay, mixed with the god's blood, is something like cosmic competence. the capacity not just to think, but to act in ways that maintain the world's order. The god's body, before the mixing, is described in the most material terms the text uses. His flesh, his blood. The mother goddess is given precise procedural instructions. Abush's analysis draws attention to the fact that the Atrahasis account does not poeticize this moment. It does not describe the god's death as a sacrifice in any elevated sense, does not dwell on the transition from divine to earthly substance. The tone is clinical in a way that is itself informative. The god is a resource being processed. What makes this disturbing, in retrospect, is the implication. If the divine element within every human being was extracted from a god by something resembling a manufacturing process, then the relationship between that element and its divine origin is not a gift, it is a residue. The Anunnaki ratify the process. Their spit enters the mixture. In Mesopotamian symbolic logic, saliva carried something of the self. Incantation texts frequently use saliva as a medium through which divine or human power is transmitted or withdrawn. The Anunnaki's contribution to the clay is not nothing. It is a collective endorsement by the highest gods of the world, and it means that every human being who was ever made carries, in the Atrahasis cosmology, not only the blood of one god, but the trace mark of all the great gods together. What the resulting human carries into death, and what the Anunnaki will eventually judge, is that residue of divine material. And if it is a residue, if what the human being carries into the world, and through death, is what remained after a god was processed into clay, then the question of which god was processed turns out to matter considerably more than it might initially seem. Because the two traditions that preserved this story did not agree on the answer. They preserved two different names. And in the scribal tradition, where the name is not a label but a definition, where naming something is the same act as explaining what it fundamentally is, two names for the same deity is not a copyist's variant. It is two different claims about what the human soul is made of. That divergence is where the next section begins. What Ereshkigal received. The underworld that the Anunnaki govern, the destination of the Etemu that the creation process produced, is described in the oldest terms the cuneiform record preserves by a journey. Not a human journey, at least not initially. The oldest sustained description of that destination in the surviving Sumerian literature is a god's. 1. The tablets themselves, excavated during the Nippur campaigns, are scattered between the Penn Museum in Philadelphia and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, which holds a substantial portion of the Nippur finds under agreements dating to the original excavation period. The composite text was assembled from multiple fragmentary tablets that do not always agree in detail, and the composite represents a scholarly reconstruction rather than any single ancient document. The text describes Inanna's journey through the 7 gates of the underworld, surrendering a divine power at each gate, descending stripped of everything she carries, until she stands before Ereshkigal, her sister, the queen of the underworld, completely divested. At each gate, a specific divine attribute is removed: her crown, her measuring rod and line, her lapis lazuli necklace, her breastplate, her golden ring, her pectoral, her royal robe. Each removal is marked by the same formula: the gatekeeper removed it and would not allow it back, and Inanna, each time, asks why. Each time she receives the same answer: be silent, the ways of the underworld are perfect, Inanna. What the text does not say, what it carefully, perhaps deliberately, avoids saying, is what relationship the divine attributes that are stripped from Inanna bear to what the ordinary dead carry into the same underworld. The attributes she surrenders are her me, her divine powers, the specific qualities that define her as the goddess she is. The implication is that the me are what keep her alive in any meaningful sense, that divinity is not a category one belongs to, but a set of specific powers one possesses, and that without them one becomes a thing rather than a being. The underworld is the place where those powers are surrendered. What remains after the surrender is the Etemu, the ghost, in its reduced post-divine state. This is significant for what it implies about the human Etemu, because the human Etemu, in the Atrahasis cosmology, was made from a god's body. If the me are what make a divine being divine, and if the god who died to create humanity was a god who possessed Temu, understanding, then the human being carries a compressed version of what Inanna surrenders at each gate, not as a goddess carries it, not with the fullness of divine attribute, but as a trace, a residue, a quality that the creation process embedded in the clay. The gate stripping sequence in the descent of Inanna is, in this reading, not only the story of a goddess's humiliation and near death, it is a map of what survives when the divine is reduced to its irreducible minimum. At each gate, something that defines the divine being is removed and held at the threshold. What arrives in Ereshkigal's court is what cannot be removed, what is left when every attribute, every power, every identity marker has been surrendered. For Inanna, what remains after the stripping is almost nothing. The text describes her as a corpse. But the logic of the Atrahasis creation account runs in a different direction. If the human Etemu was never fully divine to begin with, was always already a compression, a residue, a trace of divine substance pressed into a form that was never luminous in the way a god is luminous, then what the gates strip from it may be something closer to the accumulated material of a human life, the body, the social position, the wealth, the relationships that define the living person. What cannot be stripped is the thing that was there before the person existed as a person, the slain god's Temu, compressed into clay before the first breath. The Anunnaki who wait at the end of the stripping are waiting to assess what that divine inheritance looks like when everything else has been removed. What they see in that stripped state is the quality of the divine residue that was pressed into the clay at the moment of creation, and whether the life that surrounded it preserved or diminished what it was given. The Anunnaki appear in the descent of Inanna as the judges of the underworld court. The text describes Inanna being judged by the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld, a specific group, distinct from the heavenly assembly, who sit in the court of Ereshkigal and deliver verdicts on the dead. They are the ones who fasten their eyes upon Inanna in judgment, and their gaze alone produces her death. This is not a metaphor in the text. It is described as a physical event. The Anunnaki's judgment kills her. What she is judged on, what the criteria are, the text does not specify. That silence is the text's most important feature, because if the human Etemu descends through the same gates, stripped of whatever it carries in the same sequential fashion, then the Anunnaki, who judge it at the bottom of the process, are judging something that was partly divine from the moment of its creation. What that means for the quality of the Etemu's experience in the underworld, whether it matters what the divine element was, how it was treated, how it survived the passage through life, is a question that the Inanna text leaves completely open. The tablets on which this text survives, the old Babylonian originals from Nippur, are clay that was soft when pressed and then dried in the desert air before being fired, unintentionally, in the conflagrations that destroyed the buildings that stored them. They are not delicate in the way that parchment or paper is delicate. They are not easily destroyed by water or by time. What destroys them is mechanical force, being dropped, being crushed, being fragmented by excavation without proper care. The composite text that scholars work with is a reconstruction from dozens of such fragments, each one a piece of the argument. Ereshkigal received Inanna stripped bare. The tablets that record the event are themselves a kind of stripping. The original text held in separate collections across 2 continents, each fragment holding one piece of the descent. 2 names for the same death. Consider for a moment the possibility that the god's name in the Atrahasis creation passage was not chosen to identify a deity, but to define a concept. In the version of the Atrahasis that Lambert and Millard worked from, the primary Old Babylonian text, Sippar provenance, now in the British Museum, the god who is killed to make humanity is called Widilu or Ilawela. The name has no independent mythographic history. He does not appear elsewhere in the pantheon in a role that would explain why his blood, specifically, was suitable for the creation. The name is Thin, which is unusual in a tradition that normally enriched divine names with layers of meaning. In the alternative tradition, preserved in cuneiform sources, that appear to draw on an independent scribal school's version of the creation narrative and analyse comparatively in Lambert's later 1992 essay on the relationship between Sumerian and Babylonian creation accounts, the same god is called Geshtu-e. The name is Sumerian, not Akkadian. It is not merely descriptive. It is the name of a specific cognitive faculty, the ear as the organ of comprehension, the faculty that receives and processes. Abush's 1998 essay takes this seriously, and what it implies is striking. If the god's name in one tradition is simply a placeholder, a generic divine designation, and in another tradition his name is a Sumerian word, meaning understanding, then the two traditions are not telling the same story. The Weirlu version says, a god was killed and his divine substance was transferred to clay. The Geshtu version says, the divine principle of understanding was personified, killed and transferred to clay. The second version is not a different account of what happened. It is an explanation of why the resulting human beings can think. The god named understanding was killed so that humans could understand. The Timu that the god possessed, named in the Akkadian text as his defining quality, is reflected back in the Sumerian name of the deity himself. Geshtu is not a god who happens to have Timu. Geshtu is the Timu, personified and then sacrificed so that the personification could be dissolved into the human form. This is a move that the Mesopotamian scribal tradition makes more often than is commonly recognized, and understanding its logic is essential to understanding what the two names are doing. Personification in the Sumerian mythographic tradition is not a rhetorical device. It is an ontological claim. When a quality or a force is given a divine name and a mythographic identity, the claim being made is that the quality has independent existence. That understanding, for instance, is not simply a function of certain kinds of brains, but a power that exists in the world and that can, under the right conditions, be compressed, transferred, or dissolved into a new form. The god Geshtu is not a story about understanding. He is understanding, in the scribal tradition's most literal sense, the divine power of comprehension that was present in the world before humanity existed, that was personified and then sacrificed, and whose sacrifice is the reason that the clay creatures the mother goddess shaped are capable of anything beyond the repetition of instinct. The name confirms what the wordplay argued. The wordplay says the Aturmo carries the Turmo because it was made from the dermo of a god who possessed Turmo. The name says the god who possessed Turmo was, literally, the divine form of Turmo itself. Two different ancient scribal traditions, using different linguistic registers, one Akkadian phonological, one Sumerian nominal, arrived at exactly the same theological claim, that convergence is the strongest evidence available that the claim was genuine and not incidental. The wordplay that Abush identified in the Atrahasis, the triple convergence of Damu, Timu and Etemmu, is confirmed, from a different angle, by the alternative name for the slain deity. Two scribal traditions, working with different divine names, preserve the same underlying argument about what the human soul is and where it came from. What would it mean if the Sumerians named the god after what he was intended to transmit, if the deity in the creation story was, from the beginning, not a character, but an explanation? It would mean that the creation narrative was not a story about something that happened. It was a description of what is always structurally true about human beings. The Atemu is what it is not, because a particular deity happened to be killed on a particular occasion, but because the faculty of understanding, the Tiamu, the Geshtu, is the specific divine quality that was compressed into the human form at the moment of its creation. Every time a human being thinks, they are exercising a capacity that the scribal tradition understood to be of divine origin. Every time a human being dies, what departs their body carries that same quality as the Atemu, the ghost soul, into the underworld where the Anunnaki wait. The two names describe the same death. The difference between them is the difference between a narrative and an argument. Weirlu is the narrative version. A god died. Geshtu is the argument. Understanding was sacrificed so that understanding could live in a different form, smaller and less luminous, but genuinely present in every person who was ever made from clay. That presence, what it does in the dark, when the body is still, and the waking mind has released its hold on consciousness, is where the tradition becomes stranger. Because the Atrahasis creation account says the human animating principle derives from blood, a material inheritance, a compression of divine substance into biological form. But the oldest Sumerian texts about what happens to the human soul during sleep say something that does not obviously align with that picture. They say it moves, they say it travels, they say it leaves the body and goes somewhere that has its own geography and its own dangers and its own contact with the divine, and that what it brings back from that journey shapes the waking person in ways that the waking person can only partially understand. If the etamu is what you are when you are dead, the question becomes, what are you when you are sleeping? And the answer the tradition gives to that question raises the possibility that the human soul, as the scribes understood it, was never quite contained within the body even while the body was alive. The dream that leaves the body. Every night, something leaves. That is not a modern observation, not a metaphor from depth psychology, not a conceit imported from any tradition younger than the cuneiform archive. It is the oldest sustained claim about sleep in the written record, that what animates a sleeping body is not equivalent to what animates a waking one, and that the difference is not simply a matter of consciousness being switched off. The Mesopotamian medical and ritual literature, which is, in a very specific sense, the practical application of the cosmological ideas embedded in the creation myths, treated the departure of the animating principle from a living body during sleep not as a philosophical puzzle, but as a clinical phenomenon with real consequences and specific management protocols. A person who dreamed badly was a person whose wind soul had made an unfortunate journey. A person who could not be woken properly was a person whose wind soul had not returned. The physician's task and the ritual specialist's task, and in some cases the tasks were indistinguishable, was not to diagnose a biochemical process, but to restore a relationship between the body and the principle that animated it. The Zakiku, sometimes transliterated Zeku, appears in Akkadian texts as the dream soul, a wind-like emanation that could leave the sleeping body, travel independently, observe things at a distance, receive messages from gods or the dead, and return to the body on waking with whatever it had encountered. L. Oppenheim, whose foundational 1956 study, The Interpretation of Dreams in the Ancient Near East, was published by the American Philosophical Society, treated the Zakik as a distinct entity in the Mesopotamian understanding of human psychological structure, not a faculty of the waking mind, but a mobile agent, capable of independent movement, associated with the atmosphere rather than with solid matter. Oppenheim's analysis distinguished the Zakik carefully from the Etemu. The Etemu is what you are when you are dead. The Zakik is what moves when you sleep. They are related, but not identical. Thorkild Jacobson, in The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion, published by Yale University Press in 1976, approached the Zakik from a different angle. Jacobson's interest was in the Sumerian term lil, a word meaning wind, breath, or the invisible emanation of a living being, and in its relationship to the Akkadian Zakik that appears in later texts. In Jacobson's reading, the lil temmen is not merely a metaphor for spirit. It is a physical concept, the specific quality of aliveness that distinguishes a breathing, conscious being from inert matter. The lil is what you have when you are alive and moving, and what you lack when you are dead. It is the atmospheric dimension of life, the quality that connects a living being to the domain of Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind, and whose domain, the atmosphere itself, is the medium in which the lil exists and moves. The Zakika, in this reading, is the Akkadian elaboration of the lil concept, the specific individuated form that the wind soul takes when it is personalized, when it belongs to a specific human being and carries that person's character and experience. The lil kel is the general medium, the Zakika is the particular instance. And in the dream literature, in the text that the series Zakika preserves across hundreds of tablets, catalogued and studied by scholars, including Antonia Sgol in her recent critical work, the Zakika is treated as the primary vehicle through which the gods communicate with sleeping humans. It is the organ of divine contact. The dream literature of the Zarkika series is not primarily a manual of dream interpretation in the modern sense. It is not concerned in the first instance with the symbolic meaning of dream content. It is concerned with the movement, with the fact that the Zakiku travelled, that it went somewhere real, that the places and beings it encountered during that travel were as real as the places and beings encountered in the waking world, sometimes more so, because the gods communicated through the Zakiku in a way they did not communicate through the waking body. A dream in this tradition was not an internal experience, it was a report from a journey, and the journey had a geography. The underworld could be visited, the divine assembly could be observed, the fates that the Anunnaki had decreed could, under certain conditions, be seen by the Zakiku before they had fully manifested in the waking world. This is why the Mesopotamian medical tradition treated disturbed dreams as a medical emergency rather than a passing discomfort. If the Zakiku brought back a bad report, it was because something in the divine order was wrong, something that affected the Atemu's relationship to the Anunnaki and to the fate they had decreed. The physician who treated the aftermath of a nightmare was doing the same work, in the same framework, as the ritual specialist who performed an incantation to restore an estranged personal god. Both were managing the boundary between the human soul and the divine world on which it depended. This creates a tension with the Atrahasis creation account that the existing scholarly literature has not fully resolved. The Atrahasis says the human animating principle derives from the blood and intelligence of a slain god. It is a material inheritance, a compression of divine substance into clay. The Zaki-Krey tradition says the human soul has a wind-like, atmospheric dimension that connects to the domain of Enlil. It is a quality of breath and movement, not of blood. These are not obviously the same thing. They may be two different registers of the same underlying reality, the blood providing the substance and the lil providing the medium through which that substance operates, but the texts do not say this explicitly. What they preserve, side by side without reconciliation, is a blood origin theory and a breath origin theory, both attached to the same human animating principle, both maintained simultaneously in the same scribal tradition, without apparent contradiction. Each Mesopotamian had a lil, an invisible agent, that in Assyrian texts is described as residing in the body but capable of leaving it, functioning as what scholars have called a dream soul. This is distinct from the Atemu, though the boundary between them, in the surviving evidence, is not always clean. Jacobson and Oppenheim, the two scholars who devoted the most sustained attention to these concepts in the mid-20th century, did not fully agree on how to draw that boundary, and subsequent scholarship has not produced a consensus. What the Zaki-Kur tradition adds to the Atrahasis picture is this: the human soul, whatever its ultimate origin, has an atmospheric dimension that connects it to the cosmic wind that Enlil governs. If the Atemu is the ghost soul that descends to the underworld at death, the Zakik is the wind soul that rises and moves during sleep, that is capable of divine contact, that participates in the atmospheric medium of the living world. The question does not close because the two origins, blood and breath, the slain god's Damu and Enlil's cosmic Lil, do not obviously derive from the same source. One comes from a death, the other comes from a breath, and the difference between them, when followed carefully through the texts, leads to a problem that the scribal tradition maintained without resolving, that the atmospheric dimension of the human soul connects it to a divine authority that is entirely separate from the assembly that presided over the blood mixing in the Atrahasis. Enlil is not present at the creation event in the same way that Enki and the Mother Goddess are. His domain, the atmosphere, the medium of breath and wind, was already present before the creation occurred. What the human being receives from Enlil, through the Lil that Enlil's own name contains, is a participation in the primordial atmospheric medium, a connection that was not manufactured in the creation event but was simply assumed to exist by virtue of the fact that anything alive breathes. That assumption, and what it implies about the relationship between the human soul and the god of wind, is where the next section begins. Wind from the god's mouth. Here is the problem that the Atrahasis does not solve, and that the Lil tradition does not solve, and that no surviving cuneiform text resolves explicitly. A human being, in the fullest Mesopotamian account of its nature, has two different divine origins. Not one, two, and they do not obviously come from the same place, or from the same god, or from the same kind of divine act. One origin is the blood of a slain god, a specific event, a specific deity, a specific act of mixing that the mother goddess performed under Enki's direction, ratified by the Anunnaki's collective gesture. The other origin is the breath of Enlil, not an event, but a condition, not a specific act, but the ongoing atmospheric fact that anything alive participates in the cosmic medium that Enlil's domain constitutes. The first origin is biographical. In a cosmic sense, something happened, and that happening produced the human animating principle. The second origin is structural. The human soul participates in the atmospheric medium not because of something that occurred at a specific moment, but because it is alive, and being alive means being in Enlil's domain, breathing the Lildu that his name contains. Thorkild Jacobsen argued in 1976 that Enlil's name is not a description of a personality, but a cosmological fact. Lord Wind is not a metaphor. The wind, in the Sumerian framework, is the medium of all living action, the invisible force that allows breath, that carries sound, that moves the surface of the water. Enlil's domain is the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is not merely the air above the earth. It is the dynamic medium that makes the living world possible, the thing that distinguishes an active cosmos from a static one. That fact is the context in which the two origins problem becomes visible as a problem rather than simply as a collection of unrelated traditions. The Sumerian Lil, the word that gives Enlil his name, appears in a range of contexts that cumulatively suggest it was understood as a quality shared, in different degrees, by all animate beings. The Lil dove of a person is their wind nature, their atmospheric dimension, the invisible quality of their aliveness that belongs to Enlil's domain, as surely as their body belongs to the earth. In the cosmological framework of the older Sumerian texts, the Lil too was not merely a component of the person. It was the person's participation in the cosmic medium that Enlil governed, a real and ongoing connection between individual human beings and the atmospheric principle that maintained the whole world. Oppenheim, in ancient Mesopotamia, approached this from a different angle. His interest was less in the cosmic dimension of the Lildu than in its psychological manifestation, the Zakikum as the dream soul, the individuated wind being that moved independently during sleep. Where Jacobsen saw the Lildu as primarily a cosmological concept, Oppenheim saw the Zakikum as primarily a psychological one, the personalization of the wind element into something that carried specific human identity and experience. The two readings are not mutually exclusive, but they emphasize different aspects of the same phenomenon, and the tension between them has not been resolved. What neither Jacobsen nor Oppenheim fully addressed is the relationship between the Lildu-Zaki complex and the Atrahasis blood origin theory. These could be understood as two aspects of the same thing, the blood providing the divine intelligence Timu, and the Lildu providing the medium through which that intelligence operates in a living body. But the texts do not make this explicit. What they do is maintain both traditions simultaneously, without forcing them into a unified theological statement, which may be the most honest reflection of the genuine complexity of what is being described. There is a passage in the Enlil mythology from Nippur, part of the large Nippur literary corpus, not attributed to a single tablet, but distributed across the school texts, in which Enlil breathes, and the breath becomes the atmosphere, which becomes the medium for all subsequent living action. The image is of the god of wind, breathing out the condition for all other breathing. The significance of this image for the Atrahasis blood origin theory is not immediately obvious, and the scribal tradition does not make it explicit. But the logic runs as follows. If Enlil's primordial breath established the atmosphere as the medium for all subsequent life, then the Lildu that every living human carries is not something added to the human being at the moment of creation. It was already present in the world, in the atmosphere, in the medium, before the mother goddess mixed the blood with clay. What the creation event added was not the breath element, but the blood element, the specific divine intelligence, the timu that Geshtue or Wilu contributed through the mixing. The human being is the creature in which those two pre-existing conditions, the atmospheric lil that was already there, and the divine intelligence that the creation event introduced, first converged in a single individuated form. The clay is the vessel. The breath was already in the world. The blood was the thing that made the clay capable of receiving and sustaining the breath in a form that thinks. This is not stated anywhere in the surviving texts, but it is the reading that makes the two origins problem tractable, that transforms it from a contradiction into a description of a genuinely complex entity, a being that participates in the cosmic atmosphere by virtue of being alive, and that carries a specific divine intelligence by virtue of how it was made. Two origins, one soul. The Atrahasis tradition says the animating principle comes from blood. The Lil tradition says it participates in cosmic wind. The Sumerian and Babylonian scribal tradition maintained both without reconciling them, and did so, apparently, without experiencing this as a contradiction. The most plausible reading, given what the texts preserve, is that the blood origin and the breath origin were understood to describe different registers of the same divine inheritance. The timu as the specific content of what was transferred, the capacity to understand, to reason, to participate consciously in the maintenance of the world, and the lil as the medium through which that content was activated and maintained in a living body. The blood carries the intelligence, the wind activates it. Without both, neither works. Enlil breathes, and the world is live. A god's blood is mixed with clay, and the world has creatures capable of understanding why. The Anunnaki watch, from the underworld and from the heavenly assembly, over both processes, over the atmospheric condition that makes life possible, and over the ghost soul that carries the intelligence of the slain god through death and into whatever comes after it. Between those two forms of divine oversight, the human being exists, a creature of wind and blood, of the atmospheric and the chthonic, of a divine inheritance it did not choose, and a fate it cannot fully know. One that describes the death of the king Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, who died in a battle sometime around 2094 BCE. Ur-Nammu descends to the underworld, and the text records both the journey and the reception he receives from the Anunnaki who govern the dead. What Kramer's analysis noticed, and what subsequent readings of the text have sustained, is that Ur-Nammu's reception in the underworld is not primarily a moral judgment. The text does not catalogue his sins or his virtues. It does not weigh his conduct against a standard of righteous behaviour in the way that Egyptian afterlife texts, for instance, describe the weighing of the heart. What Ur-Nammu is assessed on in the underworld court is something harder to name in modern terms, a quality of his presence, his status, the completeness or incompleteness of his journey from the world of the living into the world of the dead. He brings gifts, he is welcomed, but the welcome is not warm in any consolatory sense. The Anunnaki receive him in a register that the text describes as formal and severe. The formal severity is significant because it reflects what the Anunnaki actually are in the earliest Sumerian texts. They are not a ruling council in a political sense, not an executive body that makes administrative decisions about the living world. In the underworld context, the context in which they most frequently appear in the older Sumerian literature, the Anunnaki are the divine witnesses to what death reveals. Their role is to see what the Enmu actually is when it arrives stripped of its living context, without its body, without its wealth, without its social position, without the ritual attention of the living. What they assess in that stripped state is the quality of the divine inheritance that the creation process embedded in the clay. One shows the Anunnaki not deliberating but perceiving. They fasten their eyes upon Inanna, and the perception alone destroys her. This has been read as the exercise of divine power, the Anunnaki killing Inanna through the intensity of their divine gaze. But it might be read differently, as the Anunnaki's perception functioning like a truth test, a form of assessment so complete and penetrating that it produces a verdict the instant it is applied. What Inanna is without her me, without her divine powers, stripped at each gate, is what she is when the Anunnaki see her, and what she is at that point is a corpse. The Anunnaki's judgment is the recognition of what has already happened to her. For human Etemu, the same logic would apply. What the Anunnaki assess when the dead arrive in the underworld court is what the Etemu actually carries, what of the divine inheritance from the slain god has been maintained, what has been diminished, what has survived the passage through a human life. The ritual attention of the living was not superstition in this framework, it was maintenance. The offerings made to the dead, food, drink, the recitation of names, were understood to sustain the Etemu in the underworld in a real and practical sense, keeping it fed and acknowledged and able to function as what it was originally made to be. 4. And its Akkadian parallel in Tablet 12 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, translated by Andrew George in his 2003 Oxford edition, records Enkidu's testimony about the conditions of different Etemu in the underworld. The testimony is organised by the conditions of each person's death and burial, and the variation in the Etemu's experience is striking. A man with 7 sons has a good seat near the gods. A man with no one to make offerings to him wanders, eating scraps. A man who was burned has no rest at all. What Enkidu's account makes visible, and what has not been fully appreciated in the popular reception of this material, is that the Anunnaki's governance of the underworld is not a system of moral accounting in the sense that any later monotheistic tradition would recognise. There is no sin catalogue, there is no weighing of action against a universal moral standard. What determines the quality of the Etemu's experience in the underworld is almost entirely the quality of the maintenance it received from the living, whether it was properly buried, whether offerings were made to it, whether its name was spoken by the people it left behind. The man with 7 sons, in Enkidu's account the clearest example of a well-maintained Etemu, does not occupy his privileged position because he lived virtuously. He occupies it because 7 people continued to maintain the relationship between the living world and the divine element that his body had housed. The divine inheritance placed in human form at the moment of creation requires, in this framework, ongoing cultivation. It does not maintain itself. The tamu compressed into clay by the creation event is a beginning, not a guarantee. What the Anunnaki assess in the underworld court is not what the person did with their life in any ethical sense. It is what remained of the divine element after a human life had been lived around it, whether the Etemu arrived in the underworld still carrying the trace of its divine origin, or diminished by the neglect and isolation that the failure of ritual maintenance produces. This is a system, but it is not a moral system, it is a maintenance system. The distinction matters enormously, and the cuneiform texts preserve it without softening it. The scholarly literature does not state this explicitly, and the surviving texts are fragmentary on the precise criteria. But the logic is present in the textual framework, distributed across the creation account, the underworld literature, and the ritual maintenance texts, if no reader has yet assembled it into a single explicit statement, that may be because the scribes who held the argument never wrote it as one. L. Oppenheim's Ancient Mesopotamia, the 1964 first edition, completed after Oppenheim's death by Erika Reiner and published in revised form in 1977, is tucked into a discussion of what he called the personal god tradition. Oppenheim wrote that no Mesopotamian text he had encountered directly explained the Ayalyu and the Lamassu, the personal god and the protective spirit assigned to each individual, in terms that would allow a scholar to state with confidence what they actually were. They must be reconstructed from incantation texts, from curse formulas, from offhand references in royal inscriptions and private correspondence, from the way they appear in marginal positions in texts about other things. No Mesopotamian thought it necessary to explain what everyone already knew. The personal god tradition is one of the least documented of the widely attested beliefs in the Mesopotamian record, precisely because it was so fundamental that it did not require documentation. What the incantation texts and the curse formulas preserve, assembled together, is a picture of the individual human being as surrounded by a cluster of protective and identity-bearing entities that are distinct from the body but intimately associated with the person. The Ilu, personal god, the Lamassu, protecting spirit, the Shidu, a related protective entity, and the Ishtaru, personal goddess. These four entities collectively constitute what Oppenheim described as a distributed protective system, a set of divine extensions of the individual self that could be lost through wrongdoing, withdrawn by divine displeasure, or stolen through maleficent magic. The loss of one's Lamassu was a diagnostic of divine abandonment. The loss of one's Ilu was a sign of serious spiritual crisis. The Ishtaru, the personal goddess, is the most directly relevant to the question of the soul's origin and the Anunnaki's role. The word Ishtaru is the same word as the divine name Ishtar, the Akkadian form of Inanna, but in the personal god tradition it functions as a common noun. Every person has their own Ishtaru, their own version of the goddess of love and war and fate, who is their companion and their representative in the divine realm. The Ishtaru is specifically associated with fate, with the Shimtu, the destinies that the Anunnaki decree for each person. In some incantation texts, the Ishtaru seems to function as the conduit through which the Anunnaki's fate decree reaches the individual. The general destiny decreed by the assembly is channeled through the personal goddess into the specific life of the individual who carries her. The Shimtu, the destiny decreed by the Anunnaki, is not a single fixed fate assigned to each person at birth and unfolding mechanically from that point forward. The cuneiform incantation literature treats fate as dynamic. It can be extended, shortened, influenced, and in extreme cases suspended through divine intervention or proper ritual action. The Ishtaru's role in this dynamic is to serve as the interface, the entity through which the general framework of Anunnaki decreed fate becomes the specific texture of an individual life. She does not determine the fate. The Anunnaki determine the fate, but she carries it, and the quality of her relationship to the person she accompanies determines how the fate is experienced and whether the divine element within the person is able to participate in the fate's unfolding in a way that maintains the integrity of the Atemmu. The loss of one's Ishtaru, described in several incantation texts as a symptom of divine abandonment rather than a cause of it, is the sign that the channel between the Anunnaki's fate decree and the individual has been broken. A person without their Ishtaru is not simply unlucky. They are, by the terms these texts presuppose, a person whose connection to the divine governance of their own life has been severed. The medical emergency that the incantation literature treats is not a psychological state. It is a structural disconnection. An old Babylonian incantation tablet in the Louvre collection, catalogued as AO 8196, part of the Louvre's Mesopotamian holdings, contains a formula for the restoration of an estranged Ilu and Lamassu to a person from whom they have departed. The formula treats their departure as a medical emergency comparable to the departure of the Zakik during a disturbed sleep. The boundary between the protective spirit entities and the animating soul entities is, in this tablet, permeable. The Lamassu's departure produces symptoms that resemble the symptoms of a Zakik's failed return. Both involve the person's relationship to the divine medium that sustains them. Both require ritual restoration. What this means for the picture of the human soul that the Atrahasis creation account implies is that the soul, as the Mesopotamian scribal tradition understood it, was not a single unified entity. It was a structure, distributed, composite, partially external to the body, maintained by ritual attention, vulnerable to neglect or maleficence, and connected at multiple points to the divine world. The Atemmu, the ghost soul derived from the slain god's blood, is the core. The Zakik, the wind dream soul, is the atmospheric dimension of that core. The Ilu, the Lamassu, the Shedu, the Ishtaru, These are the protective and identity-bearing entities that extend the self outward into the divine framework. The Anunnaki's fate decree governs the whole structure, but through the Ishtaru as its most immediate representative. What this distributed picture of the human soul means for the Atrahasis creation account is that the scribe who embedded the Damu Temu Etemu wordplay in the third column of the creation tablet was describing something far more architecturally complex than a single divine substance pressed into clay. The Etemu is the core, the ghost soul, the divine residue of the slain god's blood. But the Etemu does not exist in isolation. It exists within a structure, surrounded by its protective entities, connected through its personal goddess to the Anunnaki's fate decree, animated by the atmospheric lild that connects it to Enlil's domain, capable of independent movement through the Zarkik during sleep, and subject to assessment by the underworld Anunnaki at death. The creation event that produced the Etemu was not the assembly of a single thing. It was the initiation of a relationship between the divine element compressed into clay, the divine authorities who governed its fate, and the ritual community of the living whose ongoing maintenance sustained it through the passage from birth to death to the underworld court. The wordplay in the Atrahasis encodes the origin. What the rest of the tradition records is everything that the origin set in motion. The tablets that preserve this distributed picture are now split among at least 4 institutions: the British Museum in London, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the Louvre in Paris, and the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. No single institution holds a complete picture of the system. The argument must be assembled from fragments held in separate collections across 2 continents, in collections acquired through 19th and early 20th century excavations that were not always conducted with the attention to context that later archaeology would require. What was distributed across the ancient world in the homes and temples and scribal schools of Mesopotamia is now distributed across the modern world in institutions that do not always communicate about what they hold in common. G. Lambert's 1992 essay on the relationship between Sumerian and Babylonian creation accounts, published in the Proceedings volume La circulation des biens, des personnes et des idées dans le Proche-Orient ancien, raised a question that the Enuma Elish makes more pressing than any earlier Mesopotamian text does. The Atrahasis, as Lambert and Millard had shown in 1969, presents the creation of humanity as a decision made by a divine assembly in a time of crisis. The Anunnaki are present at the margins of that decision. They ratify it, but do not drive it. The creative work belongs primarily to Enki and to the Mother Goddess. The Anunnaki's primary role, by the account of the Sumerian and Old Babylonian textual tradition, is in the underworld, judging the dead, governing the fate of the Etemu, maintaining the order of the realm of Eresh-Kigel. By the time the Enuma Elish was composed, the Babylonian creation epic, probably reaching its standard form in the 1st millennium BCE, preserved on multiple tablets in the British Museum collection, the theological framework had shifted. The Enuma Elish's 6th tablet contains its own creation of humanity, and the creation is strikingly similar to the Atrahasis version. A god is killed, his blood is mixed with clay, human beings are made to relieve the gods of labour. The god killed in the Enuma Elish version is Kingu, the rebel deity who led the armies of Tiamat before Marduk's victory. Marduk kills Kingu, mixes his blood with clay, and declares that the resulting humans will serve the gods. The choice of Kingu is, by the terms of the Atrahasis argument, neither arbitrary nor merely dramatic. Kingu is the rebel deity, the god who led Tiamat's armies against the divine order, who carried the Tablet of Destinies by Tiamat's gift, who represented the forces of cosmic disorder that Marduk's victory was understood to have permanently resolved. When Marduk chooses Kingu's blood for the creation of humanity, the Enuma Elish is making a claim that the Atrahasis does not make, that the divine element within human beings derives from a god associated with disorder, with rebellion, with the forces that the established cosmic order had defined itself against. This is a darker version of the creation formula. In the Atrahasis, the slain god is either a generic divine being, Wi Elu, or the personification of understanding itself, Geshtu-e, neither of those figures carries a negative theological charge. Kingu carries one. The Enuma Elish's choice of Kingu as the source of human substance could be read as the theological revolution's commentary on humanity, that human beings are made from a divine element that was itself defeated, subordinated, emptied of its power, and repurposed. The Atrahasis wordplay says the human soul carries divine understanding. The Enuma Elish creation suggests the human soul carries the residue of divine rebellion. Both are claims encoded in the choice of the slain god's identity. That the Enuma Elish changed the identity but kept the formula suggests that its editors understood the formula as carrying more than the surface narrative, and then revised the surface narrative to carry a different argument within the same structure. What Lambert's analysis flagged is that the Enuma Elish creation passage appears to reproduce the Atrahasis blood and clay formula essentially unchanged. The theological mechanism of the creation is the same, even though everything else about the Enuma Elish has been reorganized around Marduk's supremacy. The Anunnaki, in the Enuma Elish, are no longer primarily underworld judges. They are the heavenly assembly that Marduk commands. They build Babylon at his direction. They receive their fates from his hand. The theological revolution represented by the Enuma Elish, the elevation of Marduk as the supreme deity, touched almost everything in the Babylonian divine framework. It did not touch the creation formula. Stephanie Daly, whose translation in Myths from Mesopotamia, Oxford University Press, 1989, remains a standard scholarly reference, noted this conservatism without offering a full explanation of it. The creation of humanity passage in the Enuma Elish Tablet 6 is, in terms of its theological mechanism, an old Babylonian text embedded in a first millennium composition. The Anunnaki who appear around it have been repositioned. They are now the heavenly assembly that serves Marduk, not the underworld judges who serve Ereshkigal. But the formula of divine blood mixed with clay, the specific claim about what human beings are made of, and therefore about the origin of the Atemu, survive the theological reorganization intact. This is not a minor observation. A theological revolution that replaced the old divine order with Marduk's supremacy had every opportunity to replace the creation formula with something more consistent with the new theology. It did not. The formula was preserved. The implication that Lambert's analysis pushes toward, without quite arriving at in print, is that the creation formula occupied a different register from the political theology of the Enuma Elish, that it was not the kind of claim that theological revolutions felt empowered to revise. The soul's divine origin, as the Atrahasis encoded it in the wordplay and the alternative name of the slain god, was apparently not available for doctrinal update. It persisted through a theological transformation that changed almost everything else about the divine world, carried forward in language that was 300 years older than the text that now contained it. Whether the Babylonian editors who incorporated the old creation formula into the Enuma Elish understood the wordplay, whether they recognized that Itemmu, Temmu and Damu were doing theological work in the passage, or whether they preserved the formula without fully following the argument it contained, is a question the text cannot answer. What they can show is that the argument survived. The scribal silence. In the scribal schools of old Babylonian Nippur, reconstructed from the thousands of school tablets recovered by the University of Pennsylvania expeditions and analysed by Paul Del Nero in his 2010 study, Sumerian Extract Tablets and Scribal Education, published by the University of Chicago, students copied literary texts in a specific sequence, beginning with lexical lists and sign exercises, and advancing to the great literary compositions, including the Enki and Ninmar myth and the cosmological texts that preserve the creation traditions. The copying was not mechanical. The students were expected to internalize the texts, and the instructional method involved copying the same passage multiple times until it could be reproduced from memory. A student copying the Atrahasis creation passage, the lines that contain the triple wordplay of Damu, Temu, and Etemu, would have encountered the convergence in the process of copying. Whether the instructor explained it as an embedded theological argument, or whether the student was expected to notice it through the act of careful repetition, or whether it was explained in a commentary text that has not survived. None of these possibilities can be confirmed from the existing evidence. The Nippur colophons name specific scribes who copied particular texts. Names like Enlil, Lipit Ishtar, and others appear in the scribal school context, identified as both students and teachers across different generations of the archive. What none of the surviving Nippur tablets from the scribal school context contains is a commentary on the atrahasis wordplay of the kind that would resolve the question of whether it was understood as a theological argument. Jean Bottereau, in Mesopotamia, Writing, Reasoning and the Gods, devoted considerable attention to the Mesopotamian practice of theological commentary, the Mukalimtu and related genres, and noted that Babylonian scholars did produce extensive commentaries on their sacred texts, particularly in the first millennium. These commentaries reveal that the scribal tradition understood its most important texts to contain multiple layers of meaning, with the surface narrative carrying deeper cosmological and theological arguments accessible only to the trained reader. The atrahasis wordplay is precisely the kind of embedded argument that Bottereau's analysis suggests the Babylonian commentarial tradition would have addressed if the relevant commentary had survived. It has not. The commentaries on the atrahasis creation passage, if they existed in the form that first millennium Babylonian scholarship produced for other canonical texts, are not in the surviving record. The Penn Museum, the British Museum, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum together hold the largest collections of Mesopotamian tablets outside of Iraq, and none of them contains the specific explanatory text that would tell a modern reader how Babylonian scholars understood the relationship between Damu, Timu, and Etemu in the creation passage. The oral transmission hypothesis is less speculative than it initially appears. The school texts from Nippur, the extract tablets, the practice copies, the colophon tablets that name the scribes who produced them, show a scribal education that was not confined to the replication of written text. The reconstruction of scribal pedagogy by Paul Del Nero and others has established that students were expected to internalize what they copied, to be able to reproduce it from memory, and to discuss it, at least within the context of the school, in terms that went beyond simple transcription. A scribal teacher who understood the Demu Mumu, a Temu convergence, would not necessarily have needed to write the explanation down. The explanation was, in a sense, already written, embedded in the text, in the form of the wordplay itself, waiting for the reader who had been trained to notice it. The instructor's task was not to add an explanation to the text, but to teach the student to read in the way the text required, closely enough, phonologically attentive enough, cosmologically prepared enough to follow the consonants and recognize what they were doing. That kind of reading instruction leaves no archive trace. It exists only in the moment of transmission between the teacher who knows how to read and the student who is learning. The absence of a written commentary is not in this framework a loss. It may be exactly what a tradition that understood its most important arguments to be self-contained would have intended. What survives instead is the argument itself, the wordplay, preserved through multiple copying campaigns across several centuries, carried from old Babylonian Sippar to whatever scribal centers produced the later versions, eventually into the Enuma Elish's first millennium compilation, and carried there without the commentary that would make its theological content explicit. The argument was preserved, and the explanation for the argument was not, or it was preserved somewhere that has not been found, or it was never written down, because the scribal tradition held it as an oral teaching, passing it from instructor to student across generations in a form that does not survive the silence of the archive. The Nippur colophon tablets name the scribes. The scribes' interpretations, what they told each other about the lines they were copying, what the school understood about what had been pressed into the clay in Sippar 300 years before the school tablets were made, that content has not come down to the present in any recoverable form. The silence around the atrahasis wordplay is not evidence that the scribes who copied it did not understand it. It is evidence that understanding in the Mesopotamian scribal tradition was sometimes preserved in forms that clay cannot hold. The copy is what survives. The conversation around the copy is gone, but the copy is enough. The argument is there, the wordplay is legible, and there is one more concept in the surviving record, one more element in the Mesopotamian picture of the human soul that the scribal schools would have transmitted, orally or otherwise, alongside everything else. It is called the Malamu, and it may be the element that the entire picture has been building toward. What three readings preserve? The Malamu, divine radiance, the luminous quality that marks the presence of a god or a divinely elevated being, is the concept that the Mesopotamian scribal tradition never fully explained in relation to the human soul, and that may be the most honest reflection of where the tradition's own uncertainty lived. In the cuneiform texts, the Malamu is unambiguously real. It appears in Assyrian royal inscriptions, in hymns to major deities, in descriptions of divine encounters that leave the human witness temporarily incapacitated by the radiance of what they have seen. Elena Cassin's 1968 study, La Splendeur Divine, remains the most sustained analysis of the concept, and Sean Zeligaster's 2012 work, Illuminated and Illuminating, the Malamu phenomenon in the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East, has since extended Cassin's framework into the comparative evidence, demonstrating that the Malamu is not confined to Mesopotamian royal ideology, but appears in related forms across the ancient Near Eastern textual world. What neither Cassin nor Astor has been able to fully resolve, and what the existing scholarly literature has not yet brought into explicit relationship with the Atrahasis creation account, is the question of whether the Malamu is something the human being inherits from the creation event, or something conferred subsequently by divine action. The distinction matters. If the Malamu is an inheritance, then the creation of humanity in the Atrahasis produce beings who carry, from the moment of their making, a residual divine radiance, diminished in comparison to the full Malamu of a god, but genuinely present as a trace of the slain deity's luminosity. If it is conferred, then it is not part of the soul's structure, but a quality added to certain persons under certain conditions. The texts do not say this outright. Cassin's reading is an inference from the distribution of Malamu across divine and royal contexts, and inferences from distribution are the most honest kind of argument the surviving record permits, which is to say, they are arguments that could be wrong in ways that cannot currently be demonstrated. Consider then the possibility that the evidence does not force a choice between three interpretive positions, but instead reveals that all three are operating simultaneously in different registers of the same tradition. The first position is the mythological symbolic reading, the Atrahasis creation account, the Lil tradition, the Zokik dream soul material, and the Anunnaki's underworld judgment are all elements of a symbolic system that describes the human experience of consciousness, mortality, and meaning in narrative terms. In this reading, the divine blood mixed with clay is a way of saying that humans feel, and have always felt, that they are more than their physical material, that something within them participates in a larger order. The Anunnaki's judgment of the dead is a way of saying that death is not random, that what a person carries through a life is weighed and has consequences. The Zakik's dream journeys are a way of saying that human consciousness is not confined to the waking body, that in sleep something moves that is not physical. None of these claims requires a literal interpretation to be meaningful. The symbolic reading honours the texts by taking their human concerns seriously without requiring a commitment to their cosmological apparatus. The second position is the encoded wisdom reading. The Atrahasis wordplay, Damu, Tiamu, Iteamu, is a genuinely compressed philosophical claim about the nature of human consciousness, encoded in a form that could survive transmission even when the interpretive tradition that explained it was lost. In this reading, the Sumerian and Babylonian scribes understood something about the relationship between biological material, blood, cognitive capacity, understanding, and the animating principle, the ghost soul, that they expressed in the language available to them. The encoded wisdom reading does not require the Sumerians to have anticipated modern neuroscience or philosophy of mind. It requires only that they observed, carefully and over long periods, that the qualities they most associated with human distinctiveness, the capacity to understand, to reason, to act in ways that maintain or disrupt the world's order, were connected to something that felt irreducible to the physical body alone. The wordplay preserves that observation in a form that outlasted the commentaries that once explained it. The third position is the compressed historical memory reading. The creation narrative preserves an actual memory of the conditions under which human self-understanding changed, a period in which people in Mesopotamia began to understand themselves as beings who carried something divine, who were not simply creatures of the earth, but participants in a larger cosmic order. In this reading, the specific claims of the Atrahasis, the slain god, the blood, the clay, are a crystallized record of a theological revolution that once happened in real time, when a tradition that did not yet understand human beings as divinely originated gave way to one that did. The Anunnaki's role in that story is the role of the divine framework that authorized the new understanding, the great gods who endorsed the new kind of being by spitting into the mixture, and who then governed its fate by judging the Etamu in the underworld. All three readings are defensible. The clay cannot tell you which of these is true. It holds all three simultaneously, the way a word can mean two things at once, without being required to choose. The way Etemu sounds like Temu because the scribe pressed them into proximity and left the recognition as the reader's work. The evidence does not arbitrate between the symbolic, the philosophical, and the historical. It provides the same text to all three readings and withholds the commentary that would have settled the question. What TZDA Abasha's 1998 analysis adds to all three is the wordplay, the philological demonstration that the encoded argument is genuinely there in the text, that it was not imposed by modern interpreters but embedded by ancient scribes, which gives all three readings a more precise textual foundation than they would otherwise have. The Melamu is not described as something the human being possesses in the same way they possess the Etemu. It is in most texts a divine quality that can be conferred on or withdrawn from humans by divine action, associated with kings who are described as carrying the Melamu as a mark of their divine authorization, and with persons who have come into contact with the divine in ways that have left a luminous trace. If Cassin's reading is correct, and the textual basis for it is thinner than for the other soul concepts discussed here, then the Melamu is not a third component of the human soul, but a quality of the Etemu itself, what the divine blood, properly maintained through ritual and proper living, continues to illuminate within the human form. The surviving record does not settle it, and the unsettlement is, in this case, the honest position. What it can confirm is that the Melamu was real in the Mesopotamian textual world, a genuine concept applied to both gods and certain humans, connected to the divine authority that the Anunnaki embodied, and that its relationship to the Etemu and the Zakik was never explicitly worked out in any surviving text. All three interpreted positions, symbolic, encoded wisdom, compressed historical, preserve what the Atrahasis wordplay established, that the human soul is understood in the Sumerian and Babylonian tradition to carry a divine inheritance. What varies between the positions is the nature of that carrying. Symbol, philosophy, or memory, the clay holds all three and cannot distinguish between them. The tablet at rest, the tablet that holds the Atrahasis creation passage, is 25 centimeters long, baked hard by circumstance rather than intention, and it rests in the British Museum's Middle East storage and study collection in a climate that is not the climate of Sippar. The cuneiform is still legible. The crack across the upper right corner still runs through the third column at the line where the god's name appears. The name on one side of that crack is Ilu, or what can be inferred of it from the lines above and below. The name in the parallel tradition, Geshtu A, understanding, the god who was named after what his death was meant to give, is on another tablet, in a different city, held by a different institution. Everything this investigation has traced is distributed like that. The blood origin in one text, the wind breath in another, the dream soul in a third. The personal gods reconstructed from incantation formulas that were never meant to be theological treatises. The Anunnaki's judgment preserved in a king's lament. The fate decree carried through the Ishtaru to the individual. The Malamu glimpsed in the margins of texts about other things. No single tablet contains the complete argument. The argument has to be assembled, which means it is always, to some degree, the assembler's argument, shaped by what was found and what survived and what the archive, through its specific history of loss, chose to preserve. There is a precision to this that the tablet did not choose, but that the archive, through its specific history of survival and loss, managed to produce. The crack runs through the god's name, not through the formula, not through the wordplay, not through the lines that record the mixing and the shaping and the Anunnaki's ratification. Those lines are intact. What is cracked is the identity of the divine being who was sacrificed so that the formula could be applied. That specific damage is in its way the most honest possible representation of what the scribal tradition itself preserved. The mechanism of the creation, the blood, the clay, the intelligence compressed into a new form, survived intact across 36 centuries of transmission. The name of the god who made it possible did not. We know what was done. We know what it produced. What we cannot fully recover is who it cost. The crack does not tell us that the god's name is unimportant. It tells us that the tradition understood the process to be more durable than the identity, that what mattered was not which god was sacrificed, but what the sacrifice was designed to transfer, the timu, the understanding, the thing that the human being carries into the world and that the atemu carries out of it. That is what the crack preserves by running through the name and leaving everything else legible. The scribes who copied the Atrahasis creation passage at Nippur, whose names appear in the colophons, who pressed their signs into soft clay under instruction and under the discipline of a tradition that had been passing this text forward for generations before them, did not write a commentary on the wordplay. If they understood what Damu, Timu and Etemu were doing in sequence, and the tradition they worked within suggests they should have, they did not put that understanding into a form the clay could hold. They copied the lines, they copied the pun, they passed it on. There is something in that silence that is not evasion. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition understood, as Bottero's analysis of the commentarial literature shows, that some arguments were carried in the text itself and did not require external explanation to exist. The wordplay was the commentary. The reader who followed the consonants D, M, cunt, cummed, cum, and recognized the convergence was receiving the argument directly, without mediation, in the same form the first scribe had embedded it. The explanation was not missing. It was the thing itself, dressed in the language of proximity rather than declaration. Wherever you are listening to this, and these texts have reached every continent, every time zone, every language that ever tried to translate them, you are in a world that the Atrahasis scribe could not have imagined, and that the tablet's argument nonetheless anticipated in its small, precise way. The crack runs through the god's name. The name carries the theology. The theology says, what you carry that thinks, that dreams, that departs the body in sleep and returns, that descends to the underworld and is received and judged and sustained by the offerings of the living, that thing was not assembled from neutral material. It was pressed from a god's dissolution, mixed with the earth that surrounds you, ratified by an assembly of the great gods, and sent forward into a form that would eventually include you. That claim exists in the third column of a clay tablet, in a crack that runs through the line where the slain god's name once was. The name is partially illegible, the argument is fully present. Whether the wordplay is a philosophical insight, a symbolic truth, a preserved cultural memory, or something that requires a category the modern world has not yet found for it, the tablets preserve it without deciding. The Atemu arrived in the underworld and was received by the Anunnaki, who saw what it was. No one has closed that question. Possibly no one can, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the question the Atrahasis wordplay raises is not the kind of question that additional evidence would resolve. It is a question about what it means to carry something divine without knowing it, to exercise a faculty whose origin the scribal tradition encoded in a pun and left for whoever was paying close enough attention to find? The answer to that question is not archaeological. It is the thing the wordplay was always pointing at, in the space between Chirmu and Itemu, in the consonants that connect intelligence to the ghost that carries it forward. The crack in the tablet is not damage. It is where the argument lives, in the space between the legible and the lost, between the name that the scribe pressed into the clay and the name in the parallel tradition that the crack obscures. Both names are real, both are preserved, neither is complete without the other. If these texts have come to you at the end of a long day, or in the quiet of a night when the world has gone still, wherever you are, and whether this reached you in a city or in stillness, through a phone screen or a speaker in a room you know well, then this is a good place to set the question down. Not because it has been answered, but because the oldest available formulation of the soul's origin is incomplete, and the incomplete is sometimes the most honest resting place there is. The scribe copied the lines and passed them on. The tablet rests in London, baked hard, patient, and partially cracked. The argument inside it has been waiting, in one form or another, in one institution or another, on one damaged line or another, for longer than almost anything else in the written world. It will still be there in the morning. If something here moved you tonight, or left you with a question you are still holding, the comment section below is a place where listeners from every part of the world have been known to leave their location alongside what they are thinking. It is a genuinely varied community, and reading it is one of the stranger pleasures this channel offers. Sleep well.